Bene, siamo giunti ad un buon punto, mi sembra. Il transpersonale non è la destinazione finale, diceva Massimo Rosselli, aggiungendo bisogna andare oltre e con. Quali perciò le principali revisioni da attuare per comprendere in profondità la coscienza, la psiche umana, la nostra natura? Quali le sfide? Quali le nuove vie per affermare il diritto dell'anima? Lascio la parola immediatamente a Stanislav Grof.
Good morning now, okay? Before I start talking, I would like to express my profound thanks to Pierluigi Lattuado and his wonderful team for organizing this conference. My wife Christina and I organized a whole series of ITA conferences, international transpersonal conferences, so we have an idea what it takes, how much time, how much energy, how much love, how much commitment, and it usually remains unappreciated. There's a lot of work that's done behind the scenes. Very frequently people, when they come here, don't imagine what it takes to bring this kind of event into a reality. I would also like to thank for this incredible energy that you all have created in this conference, and I hope that you bring some of it next year to Moscow. There, Vladimir Maikov, whom you heard last night with these wonderful Russian songs, will organize a conference in next June. Another thing I'd like to say, you will hear a lot about psychedelics. This was my entry into this area. At this point, I'm interested in the whole range of non-ordinary experiences. But during one of my previous visits to Russia, a journalist wrote an article which was called LSD Propagandist Visits Russia, and she brought my presence in Russia to the attention of the secret services. And then she orchestrated a whole, I never talked to her, a whole interview where she was asking questions and I was answering. So it's much less now in Russia, so you don't have to worry. But this can happen in many places. That the focus is then on LSD and it becomes controversial. I will be sharing with you my experiences in the study of these non-ordinary states that is extended over a period more than 50 years now, and there is a certain vision of psychology and psychiatry that emerged out of it, and I'll share it with you, and I leave it to the posterity whether this is going to be considered as lunacy in the future or foresight. Okay. So I usually start this actually by asking the audience a few questions, and they are here. Can you see it from the back, or should I read it? See, the basic question is, and don't raise your hands until I finish this. How many of you have experienced in your everyday life some powerful, non-ordinary states of consciousness? It doesn't have to be psychedelics. Can be participation in some shamanic rituals or some other native ceremonies, intense experiences during spiritual practice, some powerful form of experiential psychotherapy, experiences induced by psychedelics, near-death experiences, or intense experiences that are spontaneous, that just happen. You don't do anything to induce them. You might even be fighting them. You might not like them particularly. And they happen anyway. So can I see the hands? Any of those? Oh, you can look around. Obviously this is a somewhat self-selected audience, but we actually see something similar wherever we go. And I would like to make 2 points. First of all, I asked the question because I will be drawing on all these years of experiences of non-ordinary states. And it's much easier to relate to that material. Actually, people who have never had those experiences seriously doubt that they are possible. They think we are sort of, we are making it up. The other point I would like to make is that in current psychiatry, all so-called non-ordinary states are seen as pathological. We don't have a category, dimension. This is a mystical experience, this is a spiritual experience. So when people have these experiences, they get diagnoses. They're pretty nasty diagnoses, and the diagnoses are for life. If you have just one episode, and it never happens again, the psychiatrist would still call you psychotic in remission. Just the potential to have that experience, which is what flesh is heir to, in our culture, in our academic community, is considered to be pathology. And as you will see, it is the opposite. These experiences have tremendous healing potential, they have transformative potential, I believe they have evolutionary potential, and they have heuristic potential, H-E-U-R, that we can really learn a lot about the psyche, in health and disease. We can find a lot about the relationship between consciousness and matter, consciousness and the brain, and so on. And get some profound ontological and also cosmological insights from this. So my own entry, and I started a little the other day, when there was a question who were my teachers and how I got into all this. My entry into this realm was when I was a beginning psychiatrist, quite disenchanted with psychoanalysis, which was something that brought me into medicine. When I was an adolescent, post-adolescent, I was very much into painting, into drawing, and I wanted to go to animated movies. Some of you in Europe might have heard about Trnka. He was a brilliant animator and did animated movies and got a lot of gold medals in Cannes and so on. And I had an interview with him. I was supposed to start in animated movies, and somebody gave me Freud's introductory lectures, and I read it through night, and within 2 days I decided I let the animated movies go and become a psychoanalyst. I mean, Freud was just putting me into a kind of feverish state. My intellect was just extremely activated. And when I got to psychiatry, that changed. Then I started seeing the limitations. Initially, those were not the theoretical limitations of psychoanalysis. I still was very excited. I was, reading more books. I was getting excited about how many areas psychoanalysts have penetrated, and they gave these seemingly brilliant interpretations for all kinds of things, from the interpretation of dreams, symptoms, neurotic symptoms, the psychopathology of everyday life, the Fehlleistungen, and the slips of the tongue, and so on. But then I started seeing what you can do practically when you apply now this to real problems, and that was a different story. There was a very broad indication range. You had to meet very special criteria to become a good candidate. Not the least of them, of course, were a lot of money, a lot of time. And then I was realizing that even after years, the results were not exactly breathtaking. Many patients sort of, after a long time, were able to give stories. They could lectures why they have got the problems, how it's related to early cannibalism, toilet training, Oedipus, Electra complex, and all those things. Only the problems were still there. There was some kind of a discrepancy between the kind of intellectual understanding you seem to get and some radical changes. I spent 7 years in psychoanalysis 3 times a week, Took a lot of my income at that time. I was in Prague, which you were not getting a lot as a salary. And if you ask me, did it change you? I say I loved every minute of it. I loved analyzing my dreams. Well, I changed in those 7 years, but there was no convincing relationship between what I was doing with my dreams and free associations and the changes that happened over a period of 7 years. Closer. So I was in this crisis where I started sort of thinking nostalgically about these animated movies. I should have never chosen this discipline. I should have stayed with Trnka and with these animated movies. And then something happened in my life that just radically changed. I was working in the psychiatric department of the School of Medicine in Prague, and this was advent of the new psychopharmacol. So, tranquilizers, the first antidepressants. And we just finished a large study of Mellaril, one of the early tranquilizers, and this came from Sandoz pharmaceutical company in Switzerland. So we had So we had a good working relationship with Sandoz, which means you get some free literature. They might pay your trip to a conference when you talk about their preparations. You also get samples of other substances that they produce. So one day the department where I was working got this big box full of ampules, and we looked at it. It was very mysterious. It said in the capital letters LSD-25, and it came with this little letter which said this is a very interesting investigational new substance. The extremely powerful psychoactive effects of the substance were discovered actually by accident by Dr. Hoffman when he intoxicated himself. Actually, Albert liked to use it serendipity, but that's another story. So, just very briefly, the story was he was an expert in ergot alkaloids. Ergot is the rye fungus. The basic 3 indications for LSD, for ergot alkaloids was in relief of migraine headache, dilation of the arteries in geriatric population for the brain to function better. Albert took it till the end of his life. And the third one was for gynecology, contraction of the uterus and stopping gynecological bleeding. So this was an apple that fell a little far from the tree. So he synthesized this in 1938. He sent it to the pharmacologists, and it came back, and they say there's nothing interesting with this substance, and they suggested discontinuation. And I've had a number of visits with him, and so he told us some personal stories. And he said he continued doing more of these derivatives. LSD was the 25th derivative of lysergic acid, and he continued doing more. He said all these years he couldn't get this particular substance off his mind, and then finally it got so strong that he decided to create another sample. He felt that they have left out something important, and the idea was to send it back to the pharmacologists, toxicologists, which of course wouldn't have brought different results. But what happened as he was synthesizing the second sample, suddenly he started feeling strange, powerful emotions, he started seeing colors, visions, and he thought he was going crazy. And then he came back and then he said, there had to be some better explanation. So maybe I intoxicated myself by the substance that I was working with. And so, being a scientist, he decided to do this experiment. And several days later, he took what he said, being a conservative person, I just decided to take a minuscule, infinitesimal dose of LSD, which was 250 micrograms. I don't know how many of you can relate to that number. I had the chance to work with pure substances. But this is something that we used later as a high dose, where it required hours of preparation, a male-female diet with the patient, and we would keep the patient overnight and then talk with them if they were okay. Now he took it casually, prepared his work for the day, and so that maybe every half an hour he would close his eyes and see if anything was happening. And of course, like within 45 minutes, the effect came with vengeance, and this time really powerful. So he couldn't work. He told his assistant to take him home. And this was wartime in Switzerland. They had limitations for the use of cars, so a lot of people were bicycling. And there's this great story of Albert, riding through the streets of Basel under the influence of 250 micrograms. And actually, in California, every year on the anniversary of the discovery of LSD, there is a group bicycle ride. Many people in a similar state of consciousness, as you can imagine. And so anyway, there's a great description. He came home, and he felt terrible. He was paranoid. He had the feeling that his neighbor was a witch. I wanted to say hex, and was hexing him. So he was dying. So he asked the assistant to call the doctor. When the doctor came, he was not dying anymore. Now he had been through birth, and he was a little baby. He was newborn, and felt wonderful. Like his problems were sort of washed away, and this was the beginning of the rest of his life. So he reported this to his boss, Dr. Stoll, and it just happened that Dr. Stoll had a son in Zurich who was a psychiatrist. So they asked, do you want to do a pilot study? Which he did with a group of quote-unquote normal people and a group of psychiatric patients, and wrote this paper, which overnight became a sensation in the scientific world. But it was not the psychedelic effect. We already had pure mescaline from peyote, which was isolated at the turn of the century. It was the incredible efficacy, where you have to have 100 milligrams of mescaline to have a decent experience. You take 100 micrograms, 1,000 times less. So the initial excitement was that it's possible that the human body, under certain circumstances, could produce a substance like that, and that what we call psychosis, schizophrenia, and other types of psychosis would not be mental diseases. They would be aberrations of body chemistry. And if we can find that culprit, we can come up with another substance and we can neutralize it. And you would have a test tube solution for schizophrenia, like the holy grail of psychiatry. So there were two tips that they gave us from Sandoz. They say, maybe on the basis of our preliminary experiences, you could use it as experimental psychosis. You give it to normal people, and you can do all kinds of experiments, psychological, physiological, electrophysiological, before, during, and after, and you get a sense of what's happening biologically when the mental functioning of these people is so profoundly changed. And it's always great to have a model in medicine. So that was great. But there was another little tip that then became my karma, destiny. And it said, but we feel also that this substance could be used as a kind of unconventional training tool for psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, students. You take it, they say we feel that world that you go into has some similarity with the world of psychotic patients. So there's a chance to spend, 8 hours in the world of those patients, be able to understand them better, to communicate with them better, and hopefully be able to help them more effectively. So at the time I was in this crisis, so I wouldn't have missed it for anything in the world. So I became one of these early volunteers. And my preceptor, who got the substance from Sandoz, was very interested in electroencephalography. And at the time when this was happening, he was particularly interested in what was called driving the brainwaves or entraining the brainwaves, which means you would be exposed to a powerful stroboscopic light, and then you study if the brainwaves in the suboccipital area pick up the frequency that you are feeding in. You can basically control the brainwaves in the brain. So all of us who wanted to have the experience, we had to agree to have the EEG done before, during, and after, and also have our brainwaves driven. So, anyways, what happened practically? I mentioned the other day that I was brought to mysticism and to spirituality through clinical and laboratory work. So this was the story. I took LSD. My brother, who was a younger medical student, was my sitter because my preceptor didn't have enough time to, spend 6-8 hours with his experimental subjects. So I took it, and when it was culminating between the third and the fourth hour, the research assistant came and said it was time to drive the brainwaves. So she took me to this little room, I lay down, she pasted the electrodes on my head, and then brought this gigantic strobe, put it above my head, and turned this thing on, and in the next moment there was light like I had never seen in my life. I couldn't imagine existed. It was like when you read some of the mystical scriptures, when they say millions of suns and so on. But the only conceptual framework I had at the time was, this is what it must have been like in Hiroshima when this thing went off. Today I think it was more like the primary clear light, the Dharmakaya that you see at the moment of death, as it is described in the Bardo Tödel. But anyway, my consciousness was catapulted from my body. I lost the research assistant, I lost Prague, I lost the planet, and my consciousness had no more boundaries. I had the feeling I just was all there was. And then, as a little later, I actually was in the physical universe, or I was the physical universe, and there were things happening that for which I didn't have a name at the time. Later I read about the Big Bang and the black holes, white holes, pulsars. It was something in that category. And as this was happening, this research assistant was very scientific. She was following the protocol. Took it from 2 hertz slowly up to 60 hertz, and then back and left it in the middle of the alpha range, and then the theta range and the delta range, and turn it off. And then my consciousness started shrinking again. I sort of somehow zoomed in on the planet. I found the planet, I found my body, but then for a while I had a really hard time to get my consciousness together with my body, how those two fit together. And I knew that what they taught me at the university about consciousness somehow mysteriously emerging out of the complexity of the neurological processes simply was a nonsense. Consciousness was something much more powerful, much more significant. At that point I could understand how consciousness could create material reality as virtual reality by orchestrating experiences. I think 20 years from now, when the virtual reality is improved, we'll understand that just because we experience something, it doesn't have to be there in the form that we are experiencing it. But anyway, so I came down, I managed to get it together, land actually in a wonderful place, and I felt I'm already stuck with psychiatry, that if you're a psychiatrist, this is by far the most interesting thing you can study if you're a psychiatrist. So basically now over 50 years, I haven't really done anything else but studying these non-ordinary states. Now I'll say something quickly about terminology. Current mainstream psychiatry calls these states altered states. And those of us who have done some consciousness research really don't like this, because it's pejorative. It means that there is a correct way of experiencing ourselves and the world, and if it's altered, it's impaired. We have actually in in America, we have in the slang language, and I was looking at the wonderful dog there, but in veterinary medicine, you use the term for castration. I had my pet, I had my dog, I had my cat altered. That means, so I have too much awe and respect to these days to call them altered. And so for a while, those of us who have done research, we call them non-ordinary. But then again, there are problems. Our daughter is now married to the son of Jane Middleton Moss, who is from the Ojibwe tribe. So we have these wonderful discussions, and she says, Stan, I don't know why you call these states non-ordinary. For my people, this is just part of the spectrum of normal experience. What's non-ordinary about them? So here I think I'm somewhat avant-garde in the professional circles, and for her my perspective is very limited because I think these states are non-ordinary. But I corrected that, and I coined my own term for these experiences basically that I was asking you about, and I call them holotropic now. Holos means whole, tropic is from trapein, which means moving towards. Like in heliotropism, the plant always orients itself towards the sun, follows the sun. So holotropic means moving toward wholeness. I don't think it will surprise anybody here, but there are people in our culture who are surprised when you tell them that they are not really whole the way they are, how they experience themselves in everyday life. And I'll use here kind of the Hindu shorthand. What is beyond it? The Hindus would say we are not nama rupa, we are not body ego. Our true identity is with a kind of a divine core that we carry, which is Atman, and they give you procedures that you can follow to actually experience it. It's not a belief. I mean, you can validate that, and if you have that experience, you realize that energy is commensurate and really identical with the cosmic creative energy. So in the Upanishads it says, who are you? And the answer is Tat Tvam Asi. Archaic translation is, thou art that. This is, you are it, you are Godhead basically, you are not the Nama Rupa. Or Teilhard de Chardin says, we are not human beings having spiritual experiences, we are spiritual experiences having human experiences. About these holotropic experiences. So I will now show you just several pictures before we go on. This is Albert Hofmann at the time when he discovered LSD. This was broadcast all over the world. This was a real sensation at the time. Is there a problem? No. Okay. So he is, I should have mentioned him as my most significant teacher. I mean, without him, my life would be very, very different. And so I thought I would show you a few pictures of our encounters. My first encounter was when he came to visit us. I have to tell you this story. He came to visit us in the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, where there was the only surviving research. And he wanted to see Washington, so I took him to Washington. I saw the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Monument and so on. Then he wanted to see the White House. I drove him to the White House. At that time, you could still, park at the curb at the White House. Now it's a whole different story. And he rolled down the window and he sort of looked with this tremendous feeling of, awe. And he said, "So this is the White House where the great people." At that time, it was Nixon and Spiro Agnew, this real clown vice president. And Albert was looking out of the window and said, "So this is the White House where all the great people like Nixon and Spiro Agnew make decisions that change the course of the world." I said, "Albert, do you know what you have done to the world as compared to Spiro Agnew?" There was this sort of unbelievable humility that he had. So anyway, this was, I think, about 12 years ago, a beautiful house in Berg on the Swiss-French border. And this is Anita, his wife. Both of them are not dead. She died and he followed, just a month later. And this is Christina, the remaining person, if you haven't seen her. And now when we visited there, two wonderful visionary artists were Martina Hoffmann, the German but living in Colorado, and Roberto Venosa. You know them? Anybody knows them? No? Okay, now this is we brought Hans-Ruedi Giger to Albert Hoffmann. He is the one who designed the alien, and he is just this absolute master of the claustrophobic nightmare, the perinatal nightmare, and so they have these great discussions. They represent the two sides of the psychedelic experience. Hans-Ruedi portrays the darkest side, where the bad trips come from, and the part in us where communism comes from, and Nazism, and criminality, and so on. So this is the three of us. And then we became really good friends, Hans-Ruedi and Christina and myself. I'm now writing a book about him, giving kind of perinatal interpretations of his art. And he let us use the upper part of his museum, which is in Gruyere, in the castle. And we had a module there on fantastic art. So